God's not dead, he's surely alive and he's living on the inside, roaring like a lion. God's not dead, he's surely alive. So, as you can see, I have no tie today. We are talking about a form of media that generally has almost never been a positive experience for me. Christian feature films, specifically. I grew up watching Christian movies just about every week of my life. Considering I went to church twice a week and grew up in a Protestant Christian home, it makes sense. Through that, though, I feel like I have enough experience to discuss this topic at length. My film degree only drives home this false sense of intellectual authority I'm having. And the reason why I have singled out feature-length films essentially just boils down to the fact that some Christian short films I've seen have turned out to be okay, for the most part. And when most people think of Christian TV, they think of VeggieTales. They think of that kind of stuff. And, we will discuss that at some point. Believe me. The same connotation definitely doesn't exist with Christian feature films. We all kind of have an idea of what those are like.
Your Holy Spirit to save my son.
For some reason, I've noticed that Christian TV and short films are generally made for teenagers and youth groups and things like that, so we'll discuss that whole kind of thing another day. I feel like there's a great conversation to be had about indoctrination of children through media, but I'm not going to have it on this one. We have so much else to talk about. Plus, I think it's clear which type of Christian TV shows are trying to tell a fun story with biblical influences in there versus the ones that sort of have they're more about telling you how to think. Like this one. And since I plan to cover quite a few insidious, poorly made films that carry the Christian genre, I want this video to act as sort of a grading scale for what makes good Christian feature-length movies, and more importantly, how to properly categorize it. Today we're going to discuss 4 films in particular, each wildly different than the other. They fall into what I consider different levels of filmmaking quality, and each one carries with it a different thematic motivation behind its story and script and everything, as well as its production. Eventually, I will cover all of these films in their own videos so that I can speak about them at length and really dive into what I think makes them so bad or so good. With all that out of the way, we're going to start off with a movie that I not only consider the lowest form of faith-based movie making, but it's also easily my worst theater-going experience. I'm not going to be discussing the philosophical shortcomings in this movie, though they abound. Go check out Big Joel's video on that. He does a way better job of explaining why this movie doesn't work on a philosophical level. Go watch that video. It's very interesting. I'll instead be tearing it apart for things like a condescending script, poor editing, and overall incompetence in what it sets out to do. From the bottom of the barrel, we'll work our way up from there to my favorite Christian film. So let's get started with 2 bad ones so I can talk about the good ones already. So what exactly makes a feature-length film Christian? Well, that's entirely subjective. Many films contain themes of faith, belief, and morality. Sometimes they are specifically using Christianity as a conduit for those themes. I would not say this on its own is enough to make a film a Christian film, though. To say something like Fireproof belongs in the same genre as Silence would be unbelievably stupid. I also would not classify something like Lord of the Rings as a Christian movie, even if Tolkien was quite religious himself. The Chronicles of Heavy-Handed Symbolism, though? Oh yeah, we're going to talk about those one day too. So let's narrow it down a bit. What is the key difference between your Left Behinds and your Last Temptation of Christ's? Well, it's quite simple. One movie wants you to think about the broader role that the abstract ideas of God, religion, or a congregation have in the human experience, most of these being historical epics or retellings, while the other wants to imprint modern, specifically Western Christian, values on you and limit your interpretation of the text as much as possible. Basically any Kirk Cameron movie. These are 2 incredibly broad roads that American Christian movies tend to go down. I realize that these are not the only motivations behind a Christian movie getting made, but I think as this video goes on that the dichotomy I've created here is both useful and generally not off base. So, preamble out of the way, we're going to start with the lowest of the low. Let's get this fucking thing out of the way. For those of you who have never had to undergo this movie, the story is about a college student who refuses to renounce his faith for a philosophy class, which is something the professor has demanded all of his students do for the sake of class efficiency. The student, who has one of the most punchable fucking faces I've ever seen in my life, must then squander class efficiency by arguing the existence of God against the philosophy professor. This is the central premise, while other Love Actually type storytelling goes on in the background with other characters throughout. One of the things that becomes immediately clear to you about this movie is that no one involved in its production ever went to college. I'm not saying that to attack their intellect. I'm saying they clearly don't understand how colleges work on a fundamental level. The second one also drives this home, but we're not talking about that one.
Yeah, have a good semester.
Hi.
Manye.
What does PRC stand for?
People's Republic of China.
Oh, seriously?
Oh, yes. Always serious.
Now, why am I starting with this one, and why am I so quick to dismiss it and talk down about it? Well, because it's not a movie. It's propaganda. It's Christian propaganda, plain and simple. Poorly shot, poorly edited propaganda, but propaganda nonetheless. Unlike the other three movies I'll be talking about, G&D has no fundamental understanding of how to use film language to get its message across at all. I've watched this botched vasectomy of a movie about 4 times, and I remain free of any hyperbole when I say this movie has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. Every shot is flat, none of the performances have any nuance, and often fall into stereotypes.
Always serious.
The sponsored content is distracting.
Why do you wear those heels?
What's wrong with them?
You're too tall. You're taller.
The plot is laughably illogical. The aforementioned philosophy of the movie is flimsy, at best.
God is good.
All the time.
And all the time,
God is good. God.
And worst of all, the film in no way fulfills its goal of making Christianity seem appealing? Appealing, yeah, it doesn't make it seem appealing at all. Which, yes, is its only goal. When I review this in its own video, I'll be sure to cover in more detail how the movie fails as a movie. For the purposes of this essay, I'm going to use this video and this film as well to kind of focus on 5 terrible qualities that I think this irredeemably bad movie shares with every other irredeemably bad piece of Christian media. Certainly the ones that we're going to cover on this channel. Number 1, the movie is a product before it's a piece of art. This is not exclusive to one medium or genre at all, but Christian filmmakers often speak about how film is a means towards spreading their message, including the creators of this very movie. Therefore, I really don't have to try and justify this claim all that much. Films are not art to them. They're a tool to spread a message, and that message is God is good. When is God good? All the time. God is good. He's good, man. So good. Number 2, the movie never allows for any interpretation. Every question, well, it's not so much harshly answered as never really posed legitimately in the first place. There are no morally reprehensible or ambiguous actions on the behalf of Christian characters, while the atheist characters act out of malice literally all the time. The story also never poses any complicated scenarios or even any real drama that may, dare I say, get us to relate to the characters in any meaningful way. Number 3, it avoids complicated questions about faith and Christianity altogether. You'll never get any actual criticism of religion or religious people in this movie. Not even the simple stuff. No questions about why God allows bad things to happen, no indictment of fake or manipulative Christians, and you'll certainly never get an atheist character who is also a decent human being.
I have cancer.
This couldn't wait until tomorrow.
What?
Which leads into the next aspect of these movies, fear-mongering. This film has an almost Trumpian method of depicting non-Christians. Not almost, it's honestly exactly how that bag of pus operates.
Mr. Robertson. Hi, or should I call you Willie?
You can call me Willie.
Amy Ryan. I vlog The New Left. Can I ask you a few questions?
The Middle Eastern characters are never indicated to be Muslim. They never do anything that shows what religion they belong to. They're just, they talk with an accent and they're brown. That's their characteristic. I would, good Lord, this movie. All we really know about them is the religion they don't belong to. So this is just racism. These Chinese characters apparently talk in completely different dialects and only have a stereotypical motivation of, I must impress my father or be without honor. He won't think I'm honorable if I like God, I guess. That's his motivation. And every atheist character has some flimsy, traumatic reason for hating God or eventually joining the church.
I have cancer.
And it's usually when you notice this quality that the fifth one becomes clear. Number 5, it's made for Christians and no one else. As I said, this movie is propaganda, and propaganda is most effective in an echo chamber. But you would think that a religion that talks about spreading its message over 30 times, I think, in its holy text would create media that casts a wider net than this. You can usually tell by the halfway point which of these movies was, made to try and convince atheists and agnostics versus the ones which were made to kind of reinforce established ideas, namely the ideas of out-of-touch seniors, bigoted zealots, and/or people who take PragerU seriously. Now, we could probably find more common ground between all of the bad Christian feature films, but these to me are the 5 most essential qualities of what makes a Christian movie awful. And I would go as far to say that any poorly made piece of religious media in general would probably have at least some of these qualities. Now, would I say that you should watch this movie and movies like it to get a better idea of what I'm talking about? No. No. I watched this film with my D&D group as a so bad it's good movie night, and if it were about 20 minutes shorter, I could probably recommend that you do the same, but sadly, the editing bleeds over from being poor in the moment-to-moment department into being terrible on a structural level. This movie just goes on for way too long to recommend that you watch it, ironically. But Robe Guy, you may ask, are there any bad Christian movies you'd recommend for a so bad it's good night? Hell yeah. The next movie we're going to talk about is exactly that kind of movie. And, the bizarre thing about it, this movie is far worse on a technical level, yet it at least succeeds in trying to get a message across using film language most of the time. I'm, of course, talking about The Encounter, another piece of churchy schlock that also got some sequels and a series, I guess. I'm not watching that. To the surprise of no one, the plot is very simple. A bunch of people all on the same backcountry road, struggling with their faith, have to escape road troubles and a stock footage thunderstorm by stopping at a diner where actual Jesus is working behind the counter.
Hello?
Hello? Please, have a seat anywhere.
I couldn't make this up if I tried. Now, let me start by clarifying that this is a bad movie in every way. It may try to convey themes of faith, fate, abandonment, but it ultimately fails because of things like a strobe light used to make lightning effects, a police officer carrying 2 shotguns named Officer DeVille.
Tell that guy at the diner, Officer DeVille sent you.
The focus puller deciding when and when not to do his job, a woefully miscast Discount Charlie Day as Jesus, a corny script, and it falls into bad Christian movie elements number 3 and 4 from time to time. That said, this is miles better than God's Not Dead, and I would tell any practicing Christian to watch this one before wasting their time with a movie that actively talks down to them. But why exactly? Well, simple. Like the plot. This movie, to an extent, feels like it was made with a non-believer audience in mind. It at least tries to make the idea of God's love and an eternal afterlife through morality something appealing to those outside of the church. The stereotypical atheist/ex-Christian character Nick is easily the best one in the movie, not just because he's the only decent actor on screen here, but also because the film uses his cynicism towards Christianity in very believable ways. Nick levels some legitimate criticism against diner-owning Jesus here.
What about the people that blow up abortion clinics? I've never once asked anyone to blow up an abortion clinic.
But you do remember telling the Israelites to kill the Canaanites before they entered the Promised Land. Men, women, and children, even the livestock. Today we have a word for that. Genocide.
For a non-believer, you know your Bible very well, Nick.
Answer the question.
Perfect time.
No. I'm not gonna let him off that easy. I want an answer.
Unlike the evil professor from G&D, Nick and the other characters struggling with faith have some genuine, if not cliché, attempts at development here. There's even a great moment where Jesus talks to Sir Cux-a-Lot over here and his wife about how she's not a real Christian just because she goes to church and teaches Sunday school, which... Now, going back to Nick, does Jesus actually address Nick's concerns or philosophical questions in any meaningful or logical way? No, of course he doesn't. But the effort is not lost on me, and unlike God's Not Dead, I can definitely see why this movie became so successful among church folk. Should you watch this one yourself? Yeah. But don't expect it to reignite or spark any faith in God. The movie works very well as an unintentional comedy, or perhaps an unintentional horror at some scenes. If anything, it will just make you seem very creeped out by Jesus. Again, I will talk about both of these movies in their own reviews, and I cannot wait to do so. I cannot wait to talk about some of these scenes with you guys. I know some of you have seen God's Not Dead, but I know most of you have not seen The Encounter. Now, that's bad Christian media out of the way. What do I consider to be superb Christian media? I'm going to go straight from the middle and I'm going to go all the way to the top, and then I will talk about the one that I consider to be sort of, good, but not great. Something that's at least, it's trying to be great, but you'll see when I get to it. So what Christian feature film do I consider to be superb? Well, when I think of a film that accurately portrays biblical beliefs, tells an engaging story, and has something to say through the use of film language, I adore this movie, and I always will. Yes, the voice cast suffers from some Hollywood-style whitewashing. Yes, the comedic relief bogs it down. And yes, the child-friendly elements often clash with aspirations of being a mature story about brotherhood and destiny and slavery. Even with all of that baggage, though, it still manages to be an uplifting, beautifully animated film evoking hope in something greater, how the actions we make now can absolve us of our past sins, how we carry our family's trauma long after they're gone. This is all elevated by some of the greatest music I've ever heard in a musical, much less an animated musical. Yeah, I know this is a biblical retelling of Exodus, whereas most Christian movies are about the modern world and how to best practice your faith in it, but that's also one of my biggest issues with a lot of Christian movies. Animation definitely helps create a much-needed comfort zone from the more serious cosmic aspects of the film, but the time in which the story takes place does this as well. It honestly is essential to any faith-based story where godly miracles are going to be a central focus. No one in the modern world has seen a Moses-style wonder happen. Never. You're lying or you're mistaken if you did. That's why no atheist will be convinced of the existence of God by a breakthrough or your I can only imagine style movie making. Trying to convince audiences of different backgrounds that these outlandish magic tricks happen in real life in the modern world it's a tall order, especially in a world where debunking these types of things is a hobby for a lot of people. In a way, I think it kind of turns them into bad urban fantasy, but we'll talk about that another time. And yeah, from a historical perspective, we know that the story of Moses could not have happened based on a lot of archaeological evidence, but being historically accurate is hardly how the Prince of Egypt tries to play its hand. It instead creates compelling characters with noticeable arcs over the course of a brisk 90-minute runtime. And let me tell you, there are some straight-up Shakespearean moments in this movie between our two main characters. Ramses is a man forced to carry the evil legacy of his father, the Pharaoh, while Moses must learn to abandon a life of luxury and privilege in order to free the enslaved people that he almost belonged to himself. It's a wonderful story about identity, hope, and, most importantly, faith. Moses has to take on the most powerful civilization on earth by himself, with nothing but the belief that the great I Am will see him through it. If this type of story were done by pure flicks, you know, where the protagonist has to face off against a secular authority on behalf of God, it would probably involve something asinine, like a teacher having to stand up against a school system for her right to be And one of the main things that separates this from lesser Christian films is that it never shies away from one of the things that people find most disturbing about the Old Testament, which is the horror of God's wrath. We see all the plagues, all the violence, slavery depicted pretty accurately, for a PG movie. And it depicts the Exodus story basically in full, minus what happens after this moment, after the end of the movie. You Bible bangers out there all know what I'm talking about. Though the freedom of a whole race of people is on the line, the movie leaves it up to the viewer if God's plagues are a justifiable means to an end. Even Moses is forced to confront the horror of it all in some of the most touching frames of animation I've ever seen.
You and your people have my permission to go. Leave me!
I have brothers, so this movie has always hit me on a personal level. Thankfully, my brothers aren't slavers, though. Watch this movie if you haven't. You know the story already. Moses is right up there with David and Goliath in terms of relevance, but try to watch it as though the film is being an ambassador for Judeo-Christian beliefs. In that respect, among others, it is miles ahead of the overlong Ten Commandments or any other Hollywood adaptation of Old Testament stories. At very least, you'll have an amazing time with the score. I can guarantee that. Okay, so the next movie we have to discuss, it's sort of in the same camp as Prince of Egypt. I think it's a very great, enjoyable movie, and I think it takes way more chances than Prince of Egypt. I think it's a very disjointed, flawed movie, but even in light of these shortcomings, I still consider it to be one of the most relevant Christian movies made since Prince of Egypt. That movie is... Yeah, I really like this movie, guys. I'm sorry. I really do. And frankly, I thought more Christians would after it was all said and done, but... So, we all know the story of Noah, and the movie is clearly aware of this too, since it spends a very long amount of time developing the world and the characters before the flood is even presented as a main plot point, and even longer before the flood shows up, actually. Not all of this movie works. As I said, while I personally think things like the holy relics, the costume design, and even the rock monster... Yeah, there are rock monsters. They're fallen angels who have become wrapped in earth and after they fell from heaven. Even they are things that I think are pretty neat, but they're not objectively good story elements. I wouldn't blame someone for thinking certain aspects of this movie hold it back from being even good. The thing that I walked away appreciating the most in this movie was what it had to say about divine intervention and interpretation. It also has the best depiction of God in any movie ever. I'm going to explain that one real quick. I don't want to spoil this movie too bad, as I would like some of you watching this video to see it first. It's genuinely a gripping story at times, and there's even some action thrown in for good measure. But what I will spoil is that God never shows up in this movie. You know, at least not in physical form. He doesn't even have lines, and it's honestly because of this simple decision that when Noah begins receiving visions about the end of the world, he's not exactly 100% reliable. When you watch it, you'll see what I mean. Now, how is this possibly my favorite depiction of God if he's not even in the movie in a technical sense? Well, that's the thing. God is definitely in the movie. The universe of the movie is centered around his existence. He just isn't voice acted or cast in any way, which I think is the strongest element about this depiction. Anytime a movie or show has God talking in an authoritative, booming voice, it takes me right out of it. This movie version of God should have died out after things like The Simpsons started parodying it and everything. I'm going to go out on a limb and actually say that the moment that a movie casts an actor to the role of God, that's the equivalent of a video game putting a life bar on Cthulhu. And for those of you that are aware of what I mean by that analogy, I think you'll understand this best. It's also just corny, and no one has ever heard God speak to them in this manner. Don't lie. You haven't. For you McConnell voting whack jobs out there that speak in tongues, no, God is not speaking through you. You can consult my good friend Corinthians about that. Now, the reason why Noah's version of God works so well for me is that the plot of the movie is centered around him. The character of God drives the plot forward by speaking to Noah through vague, sometimes horrifying visions and dreams. While we of course know the story, some of the fun in this movie is watching Noah get bits and pieces of the visions entirely wrong. Because God is not speaking to our main character like, Noah, you must build an ark and save your family. The rest of the world is evil and I'm gonna flood it. It creates this bleak scenario where Noah believes God wants all human beings to die out and give the world back to the animals that once populated the Garden of Eden in peace. You don't often see Bible heroes as real people with internal conflict, and Russell Crowe absolutely nails it. The weight of the survivor's guilt him and his family carry after the flood is wonderfully portrayed by all the actors involved. It takes massive liberties with the Bible story in order to achieve some of these tonal elements, such as Noah's sons not being allowed to bring wives onto the ark, but it's all the better for these changes. Most of the time. I realize a lot of Christians may find this film blasphemous for the bigger changes it makes to the story, but honestly, I never felt a stronger connection to the story of Noah until this film came out. Instead of retelling the same boring story, the same unengaging story we've heard a million times that has no themes outside of you better listen to God or else you might die in a flood that he'll promise never to do again with a rainbow, Darren Aronofsky tells a story that asks the viewer to consider which is greater and more important to you, the power of God's love or his wrath. Noah's struggle isn't always something abstract like the fate of the world. It's something believable, like trying not to imprint your own earthly beliefs onto your religion. Wait, Darren Aronofsky made this? What? Huh. Talented atheists making better religious films than talentless religious people. Who'd have thought? If I had to tie a sort of rating to Noah, I'd probably give it a 7 out of 10 because a lot of the film is clumsy. But it's still a movie that when I, become nostalgic for that belief I had as a kid, Noah's the only movie that comes close to kind of giving me that similar feeling. Because at very least, I can say that Noah successfully mystified Christianity for me again in a way that I didn't think was possible. And that's why I think most people should at least see it and see what they think about it, if they can even get past the rock monsters. So that's it. Those are 4 Christian feature films that I think show my grading scale. and I think will be very useful to you guys in order to understand my process moving forward with the rest of the Christian films I watch. It's going to be a couple weeks before I talk about more Christian movies because I really want to flesh these videos out, and I want to talk about more topics in between all of this stuff. I don't want my channel to be the Christian movie discussion forum, but we're going to be talking about some interesting movies, some of which I've seen before, some of which I've just heard about for the first time, and some of which were recommended to me by people I highly respect. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you to everyone that gave me suggestions for movies, by the way. What I plan to talk about next week is something that actually came under fire from Christians for a while there. I'm going to be talking about D&D next week, Dungeons and Dragons, for those unfamiliar. You know, I wear a robe all the time. Of course I play Dungeons & Dragons. Thank you guys for watching this long-form video all the way to the end. I look forward to talking about Christian media with you further. Leave some more suggestions down in the comments for me to watch them. I will watch them. Believe me, I have a list, and I'm burning through it. And remember, guys, God's not dead. He's surely alive, and he's roaring on the earth like a lion.
Oh!